Andy is back from safari, and it's not like he missed a lot. There's so much to discuss with Andy Martino back with us on this episode of the Shea Anything podcast, and it starts right now. All right, welcome to the show, everybody. It's Doug Williams and Andy Martino with you. A reminder to subscribe, rate, and review to this podcast wherever you're listening, Apple or Spotify or wherever. And Shea Anything's brought to you by Verizon. It's 5G built right for the Mets from the network more people rely on only on Verizon. And once again, Baseball Night in New York. You can catch Andy and myself 6 o'clock on weeknights on SNY. This week, though, with the 6:40 starts down in Miami, we're going to be on at 5:30, so you can catch us there Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. Hello, Andy. Welcome back.
Thank you. We haven't done a lot of shows together between this and that and the other thing over the past couple of weeks. So I'm happy to be. It's fall. It's post Labor Day. And here we are both in the saddle.
I know. How about that? Did you have a good vacation?
I did. Thank you. It was split up by there was part one of the vacation, which was very relaxing, and part two, which was every time I leave my room, I miss 10 calls about whatever the bleep the Mets are up to that day. So I was, as much as I was plugged out of games, deleted all my apps from my phone and Twitter and stuff, news apps. The Mets found me in a big way. I was aware and on top of what was going on, starting with the thumbs down and into some worse things. So
people knew you were on vacation. I'm not even talking about SNY, you were plugged in with sources that you wanted to be talking to about those things?
Yeah, I was talking to sources as they were happening because it was just, this stuff was just too big to not. So I was, if you're going to report on a team, you're a gossip too. So you want to know what's going on, what people think about it. And, so I'm able to speak to what was going on, even though I wasn't here in real time.
It's good for the sake of the podcast, and putting myself in your shoes. I get it because when you go on vacation, you can kind of watch the recaps and read box scores for the games. But in your job, you can't replicate what it's like to talk to people during a story and as it's breaking and the feel for the inside scoop. You can't really just make that work up.
So those are when the real emotions come out. That's when later is the spin and the cleanup, but when stuff's going on is when you hear what people really think. So that's right. And, it's a pleasure to be, it's always a privilege to be able to be someone who talks to people who are involved in these things. So we've chosen a line of work where there are no true vacations. There are sort of tentative vacations.
Okay. So I want to start with what I'm most curious to hear, Andy, which is that I know you have a column coming out. I won't give it away in my question, but you have a column coming out about, Mets front office. And I know that one of the things that you're referencing is the Zack Scott alleged DWI
New York.
In White Plains. And I'm sure that was something. Oh, I didn't know that.
I thought I grew up in New York State. So I heard DWI my whole life, and then I started hearing DUI elsewhere. I was like, what's that? And then I found out they're both bad.
They are both bad. Where do you see, now that Zack Scott is on administrative leave, where do you see the Mets front office as high up as Sandy Alderson? And as that trickles down, where do you see them going with it?
Yeah, a lot of questions. And you're right. I'm not sure exactly what I'm writing because I want to make sure I have all my ducks in a row with something that important, but it's not a cop-out. It might sound like a cop-out, but things are very uncertain right now in terms of the Sandy Alderson administration. Look, he remains under contract. Obviously, there's been some ugly stuff that's gone on, people that he's hired this year. He was never supposed to be in charge of baseball operations as he is right now, again, as he was after Jared Porter was let go for harassment. So to predict it, that Sandy at age 73, I believe, could transition over to overseeing, say, the business side or something that's not as much in the day-to-day was the plan anyway. now we're going to have to see how it plays out with the complication with Zack Scott, because he was on track to have a prominent position in baseball operations, perhaps general manager under a president of baseball operations. But that wasn't a sure thing. Now I'm talking pre-DWI. That whole transition wasn't a sure thing because there were some people in the organization, prominent roles, who felt that a president of baseball operations was not necessary. And they really had a point, because you have an organization that you built. Sandy Alderson and Zack Scott have started to put it together. They've hired all kinds of analytics and R&D people and coaches and player development. And if you bring in, say, Chris Antonetti or Theo Epstein or any of these kind of big names that Steve Cohen has been fishing for, you start from scratch. You change the whole organization all over again in all these ways that have nothing to do with controversy or thumbs up or thumbs downs or DWIs. It just has to do with the infrastructure you put in place, and started with this organization, blow it up all over again because a new president's going to want to remake it in their image. So that was kind of the push and pull. Can Zack Scott just run baseball? He's doing a perfectly good job. Or do you need a president of baseball ops? Then Zack, of course, gets arrested, charged with DWI. So you have a leadership problem there, because this is somebody who has to be accountable to the players, who just told players that they were, I'm sure this is ground you covered thoroughly while I was gone, but just told players that they weren't taking care of themselves and their bodies. And the Baez Lindor thing had just happened, and now the leader ends up in a compromising position. So what I can tell you is there was no rush to fire him, as there was Jared Porter the day that happened. Porter was an overnight. If you remember, that story broke late at night one night. Alderson and Cohen, and they were thinking about it and agonizing over it and talking about it, and fired him in the morning. It wasn't going to go that way with Zack Scott. It's a different kind of offense, a serious one, but something that they want to be deliberate about, because they do think he's good at his job. Having said that, it's a failure of leadership to get arrested for drunk driving. So there's a lot in the stew there. And that's kind of the general temperature of things right now. Before this arrest, Zack Scott was almost certainly going to be a GM or some equivalent position. Now, I still think he could have a future with the organization. I do. But also, that's being weighed. Does more come out about the incident? Does Steve Cohen, whose decisions these are, does he think of it differently? We've known him to be a little impulsive, at least digitally. So would he one day decide, nah, we can't have this? Possible. So that's kind of the lay of the land.
So along those lines of Steve Cohen's role in this, Andy, in the middle of your answer, you said the Antonettis and Epsteins of the world are the people that he's been fishing for.
Mm-hmm.
Are you talking about pre-Alderson hire, or are you talking about right now?
Post-Alderson hire. So if you recall, they were looking for a president of baseball ops and a GM initially, right? They couldn't get permission to interview some of the people who they wanted to interview. Chris Antonetti, I think, was one of them at that time. Eric Neander in Tampa, people like that to come in and be the president of baseball ops, the Heim Bloom of the Mets, and then you hire a GM under them. Now, the Red Sox have a GM. Just no one talks about him because it's Heim Bloom's team. So that was going to be the structure of the Mets. If you remember now, after a few weeks of that, Alderson and Cohen agreed to change that search, just search for a general manager, right? Forget about the president of baseball ops. So they hired Jared Porter. They hired Zack Scott as the assistant GM. Alderson was going to mentor those two guys to become eventually president and GM, probably. Train into those roles. We know what happened with Jared Porter. It all got scrambled. So you get into the season, and Cohen is still interested, I'm told, in having that president of baseball ops, that big name guy, whoever that might be. But he's new to the sport, and pre-DWI, it didn't necessarily seem necessary the way the Mets were already running and underway. I understand they've had a disappointing second half, but as I've said, they just spent months building a structure under Alderson and Scott. It sounds sort of exhausting to blow that up and let someone else run it, like in November now, right? But
so
go ahead.
quick clarification. Were both Porter and Scott former disciples of Epstein?
They have worked under him. Yes.
Okay.
So you could, yes, they're in his coaching tree.
Right. So do you think that in order for that, I guess that was a separate point that I just wanted to clarify in my head, because I think it would be interesting to replace, say, Sandy Alderson with Theo Epstein, when Theo Epstein
already hired
was exactly the guy who had already hired and Jared Porter and had already hired Zack Scott. Not that, you could have predicted what Zack Scott did, like you could have with Jared Porter. Totally different situation.
But if you're going to say Sandy should have known, it's only fair to say Theo should have known.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that goes into the next question I would ask you, which is, if you are going to hire Antonetti, Epstein, Stearns, any of these guys, right? Does that mean then that you're talking about the exhaustion of a new regime and face of the Mets front office and hierarchy?
Here we go again. Yeah.
Would that mean Alderson would be gone?
I don't know about gone, but remember, he was always supposed to be the team president. So he could still be that. That's not someone who's in every baseball operations discussion, or even most of them, right? That's someone who's running business, communications, community outreach, everything. You're running the organization, right? So Sandy could go back to doing that, or he could transition over into the business side entirely. Sort of depends who they hire, if they make a hire. Zack Scott's behavior and Jared Porter's behavior kind of gives Cohen an excuse to wipe that claim without bad PR. It would have been it would have been the it would have been the PR win the morning after Zack Scott's arrest to fire him. I'm gonna go, yeah, good job cleaning up the culture. But the problem is he's pretty good. So that these are all the things they have to do.
Reminder, Shea Anything is brought to you by Verizon. It's 5G built right for the Mets from the network more people rely only on Verizon. Okay, I want to move ahead to the on the field stuff, Andy, because I think there was a point last week where I would have thought that the on the field stuff would be an afterthought, because I will say it's mostly because of the Mets schedule. They're kind of like statistically back in it, sort of, kind of. They're still going to have to win a lot of the games left in order to have anything to do with the playoff spot. However, there's still some interesting topics and some interesting players to talk about. So let's do a 3-batter rule, and we'll start with Edwin Diaz. So earlier in the season, you and I talked about him extensively. It was like, yikes. I think maybe the experiment is over. So it's not like that, he'd been pretty good for a while there, but there weren't a lot of high leverage saves, and he blew 2 games this weekend. And, the Mets lost 2 out of the 5 games to the Nationals. It felt like they really had to win all of them, if maybe lose 1. What do you do now? I mean, what do you do going into an offseason with him? How do you proceed with this player?
If you could trade him, right? I mean, come on already. Like, enough agonizing debates over whether he can make it in New York, and people, no, you're stupid. He's got great stuff. No, you're stupid. He's doesn't have the head for New York. Can we just clear the deck and move on? If I have to cover a new GM and get used to that, I'd like to cover a new closer at least, who doesn't change games late and make our job more complicated. No, like, Diaz is Diaz, right? We know how great his stuff is. We know how often he's ineffective. See what you can get for him. That's what I think. What do you think?
I mean, I think I agree.
It's about to get more expensive too. I'm sorry to interrupt, but about to get more expensive.
You mean with team control?
Yeah. Arbitration years and whatnot.
Yeah. I mean, look, I don't know what the Mets would be able to get for him. I feel like it could surprise me with how much they could get for him or how little. Because I think other teams would say, why would we overpay for somebody who we know has been clearly ineffective in big spots for you? I could also see a smaller market team being like, I want this guy. I can fix him. Our pitching coach is a guru. He can figure it out. But I'll tell you what, I think watching Chapman and Diaz in this town this year has been such a fascinating examination in terms of the importance of that role, but also just how hard it is to be really good at it. Like, it's just impossible. And I do this every so often. I just look at Mariano Rivera's Baseball Reference, and you're just blown away by the consistency, and it just doesn't exist. So I think we get caught up in the Diaz thing because it was such a big trade. Like, if it had been a one-off and a prospect that no one had ever heard of, and the Mets got him without Robinson Cano's contract attached, and it was just like, I think it would be less of a story. I mean, closers are always a story, but it would be less of one. The fact that he came over in the fashion that he did is a big part of it. I just don't think the Mets are that special for having closing issues.
Well, that's a great point. That's a great point.
It's so common, and it's just very high profile here, but it's everywhere.
You're 100%. You're right. It's very rational. But can maybe the Mets? Maybe it's just time to do it with someone.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you at all. At all. I mean, it's just for the sake of him, the team, the fan base, us, our sanity.
He could go somewhere else and thrive. He's a potential change of scenery guy, sure. But that's so make a trade you feel confident about. Chris Antonetti, Theo Epstein, whoever's making a trade.
He's the rare change of scenery guy who didn't need a change of scenery. Like, maybe he just needed to be in Seattle for the rest of his career.
Maybe.
By the way, I guess you jokingly mentioning Antonetti or Epstein, I feel like I left a little bit of meat on that bone, and I'll get to the 3-batter rule in a second.
Okay.
Do you think there's a legitimate chance the Mets hire either one of those two?
Yeah.
Does that have something to do with the column that you're writing a little bit later today?
No, look, I'm not trying to be cute. I'm just trying to get my ducks in a row, as I said before. Saying anything in SNY social clips this off and says Andy says they're going to hire one of these guys or something. Leave it in the long form podcast. Don't clip it.
Make that the headline.
Don't clip it.
Have you ever noticed in almost every single promotional clip that we tweet, I am not talking? And I'm starting to wonder, am I that boring? Like,
two things.
You know what I need? I need to become more of like a hot take artist, I think.
I think here's what it is. You ask good questions and I talk too much. That combination leads to what you've described.
Maybe my role is, strictly facilitator. I'm John Stockton. My job is not to shoot, not to score, but, to set people up.
That's right. You're one of we've had some good point guards at SNY, and I do dare say that you might be one of the very best. And there we go. That's a good analogy.
That's why I brought this up. I wanted to compliment it.
You wanted to lead to that. It was in the script, actually. I shouldn't have said that.
This is all scripted. I'm reading off a teleprompter.
Anyway, look, those are the kind of guys that the owner has been interested in. I would leave it at that. I actually don't want to go too far hyping up the Theo thing, because you hear a lot of different things about Theo, many of which are that this whole thing is being talked about a lot more than it should be. It's sort of like, you remember when the Mets and the Cubs were going to trade like a pitcher for position player for 5 years? It's like a arranged marriage. Like, well, they got to trade Wheeler or Syndergaard for Starlin Castro or, Chris Bryant. Remember all that? It was like, it's gotta happen.
I was going to compare it to, like Bill Cowher in the NFL. He was in the media and didn't have a head coaching job for like every offseason for 5 years. It was, are the Giants or whoever had a vacancy going to hire Bill Cowher? Nobody did, because he didn't want to do it.
There you go.
And the teams didn't want, it's maybe as the years go by, there's a reason that things don't happen.
Yeah.
So the other of the 3-batter, and if you want to work your opinions or any thoughts that you have on the thumbs down thing that you were away for in the midst of doing this, you can. But I want to talk Javi Baez more so because, look, you can't script a more fascinating tenure as a player post deadline than he's had. He's red hot right now. He shows you every day why he's sometimes a headache and sometimes maybe the most talented player some of us have ever witnessed. But there's this kind of like, you got the looming free agency coming off of the thumbs down, the apology that was more of the like, I'm sorry, I'm sorry if you were offended, what you're not supposed to say. Is your read between the Yankees and the Mets that they saw that, and they, as organizations, they were really cringing. Like,
oh, definitely.
Gosh, you cannot do that. Like they really thought that was an important thing that happened.
Definitely. The only reason I'm not saying Baez will not play for the Mets next year is because I can't say anything with certainty when I've just told you that I'm not exactly sure who's going to be running the Mets next year. And we know that the owner can be impulsive, digitally at least. He seems to run a good business, but so we'll see. But I don't see it because yes, it was taken very seriously in those front offices. It's not that they have a moral objections to thumbs downs. It's just bad business, and it shows. There's a constant agonizing thing that those Yankees and Mets front offices always have to go through is, will this guy be bothered by New York? Which is not a media narrative. It's a real thing. It's happened to, remember Javi Vasquez, the terrific pitcher who could never be a Yankee, and plenty of Mets over the years, Jason Bay, et cetera, et cetera. Like there are people that, and I know I love Jason Bay as a guy, good person, but I know that like when media relations would try to get him out to talk after a bad game, he would not want to do it. He'd be like, no, he's just low key. And New York was part of the issue there. I know he played in Boston, but what can I say? It didn't work in New York. There are people who it doesn't work in New York. So if you get a strong clue that something plays that badly in this market, I mean, Lindor pretty much identified himself that way, except that he's already on a contract. So what are you going to do? But Baez isn't.
Yeah.
Obviously.
Doesn't it make the conversations we had so fascinating before the Mets signed Lindor long term? We were talking about, do you capitalize on a free agent year and let this, it's going to be a week of bad press. Why didn't you sign him? Why didn't you sign him? But then you have it'll blow over and you have a year of a guy with a lot to prove and you see how he plays here. Mm-hmm. And looking back, it's like, man, that was the move. That was the point of view. And look, I mean, he could hit 320 next year with 30 bombs and 100 ribbies and the Mets could win the World Series. And then suddenly, we sound like idiots again, but man, it to not have a read on how, I said this a couple of weeks ago, to not foresee that Mr. Smile would have a hard time when times were tough in New York was probably my bad and some other people's bads with checkbooks.
Yeah, I didn't know he was going to have a tough time, like he's behaviorally in New York. I just thought that why would you invest before you've seen if it's a fit? So right. Yeah, I didn't predict that. Neither did you. Neither did almost anyone. He did well at first in the way he presented himself, and might again. He's a guy who strikes people around him as pretty special as a person. Right. I want to note that. And that's I
remember that conversation you said you had with Dom Smith, where he was like, "This is the guy we want back because we all feed off of him." I'm paraphrasing.
Yeah. So you got to listen. Yeah, one has to listen to that, and I wouldn't want to be booed either. I mean,
no.
But I actually have some empathy for that. It's the same reason why anytime somebody says something to me that I feel is inappropriate, I quietly block them on Twitter because I don't want to have that to be part of my life. I just don't want it. I don't feel like it's my obligation to have it. So I understand where those guys are coming from in that, but I mean, I guess I quietly block them rather than like type out like you're a stupid idiot, which is kind of what they did.
Would you say, because I waxed poetic, got on my soapbox, whatever, about negativity and its role in everybody's life and how there needs to be some constructive criticism in your life in order for it to be a healthy one. You're not blocking out any and everybody with something to say. Like
me?
Yeah. Like
no,
if somebody says,
I do.
If anybody says anything negative, they're gone.
Yeah, but just quietly like block and move on, because here's my thing. I don't want to have a Twitter account. I think that having negativity accessible on my phone is not good for mental health or anything. So the second anyone says anything I don't want to see, that person is blocked. And I feel like that's my right, because I don't want to participate in Twitter. I'm just trying to do the bare minimum because I need to do it to spread news that I gather. But I don't want to see that stuff. So my point is, I get where those guys are coming from, but I think there's two differences. That's why I'm not trying to come down on these guys. Like I understand that some of the people booing you are real mean people, and they're probably saying mean things that haven't been repeated to us, and it's really unpleasant. Two things. One, I don't do just the blocking is different from like putting the thumbs down thing is like insulting your customer, like way out there. So it's a little different. And also, I hate to be, hey, they get paid the big bucks, but man, do they get paid the big bucks. And that's part of the job in a little bit of a different way than a lot of people. So,
yeah, it's a fascinating point in conversation. I mean, I hate to say this without knowing for sure, but I believe I read in Forbes or somewhere that with the signing bonus and Lindor's scheduled salary, so when his new contract kicks in, I think as soon as the season's over, and the deal that he's making in the last year of his arbitration with Cleveland, he's making, I think, a total of $43 million, which means he's making, I believe, around $100,000 a day. Mm-hmm. So that should make things a little easier. And there has to be an awareness of like, okay, yeah, I'm very different. I'm in a very different situation from everybody else. But I do think you make a fair point about the place that negativity has, and you're like, you don't want to be there anyway. So for someone to make it any more of an unpleasant experience than it already is, gone.
And that's not, you mentioned constructive criticism. That's not where constructive criticism is offered, obviously. I take that from my friends and colleagues, not from.
No, but I feel like I've seen people who, are being not unkind to you, who disagree with something you say, and you respond to them. Like that's what
usually if someone's reasonable, sure. But more and more in my life, I'm trying to make that not a place where I have any conversations, because I think that's better, net better to not have any conversations there. But anyway, enough about me. Wait, there was something I wanted to say about this, to the point you're making about Lindor. I lost it. Keep talking.
So Pete Alonso's last of the three battery. Andy.
Yes. I'm sorry. He's involved in this too. Can I make a quick point? It's about my friend Tyler Kettner in the New York Times wrote a great column after the thumbs down thing, and Pete Alonso was his lead in the column, and he was using Alonso's quotes from a few weeks prior to that about how, hey, everybody, it's going to be fine. Don't be so negative. And then Stroman's tweets, and how Stroman and Pilar were actually cursing at fans in the aftermath of the thumbs down before Alderson's statement, I think. I'm a little fuzzy on that timeline, but didn't Pilar say like a curse word if you don't know about?
Yeah, at one fan, yeah.
And Stroman, I think, retweeted it. Anyway, so Tyler did this great job. He rarely does a takedown. And when he does, it's really effective because he picks his spots. And it was just like, so these Mets, for some reason, everyone's a hater if they're not completely on board with just how great you are. And I'm paraphrasing Tyler. Read the column. Go look it up if you haven't yet. But it's about this team has a culture where it seems like Lindor and his aversion to booing is a big part of this, where it's just like, you can't hate on us. You can't criticize us. We're immune to it. And it's just, that's not a productive way to look at it if you're a New York athlete. And I understand that might come across as a little bit contrary or even hypocritical to what I just said about my own Twitter account. But I do think we have different jobs, me and them.
When you were gone, did you by any chance read or see what Gary Cohen said about that on the air?
No.
I'm going to read it to you quickly, a very short part of it. But he said, he's talking about the players. They see less of the media. They see less of the fans. They're mostly amongst each other. And I think it becomes really easy at a certain point in a group dynamic, that clubhouse, to look at the situation as it's us against the world, and all those other people out there, whether it's the vitriol on Twitter or whether it's measured criticism of the media or the fans, is all people who hate us. And then all we have is us. And I think that is the part of how we got here. Similar to the point that Tyler's making. But it's interesting. But anyway, back to Pete. So in terms of the player, Andy, I feel like we've learned a lot about him this year. He may not hit 50 home runs every year. He's not Aaron Judge. He's not a great defensive first baseman. But what he is probably a consistent power hitter for your team long-term. Mm-hmm. And I think, Max put this in the rundown, that in 2019, Braves signed Acuna, 8-year, $100 million deal, which he probably is very angry about. Even though he's well paid, he should be making a lot more money than that. If you're the Mets, do you consider locking the guy up, thinking that you have close to a guarantee with 35, 40 home run a year guy?
Maybe production-wise, yeah. We like him as a player. You and I do, and everything he said is true about he's proven himself, I think, this year in a way to be the real thing. I would be real careful about any long-term commitments right now, given what I just said about their culture issues. I think a lot needs to change with the makeup of this team. And Alonso has not been himself without some incident in this, including the comments I just referenced. This wasn't terrible, but it's just part of an attitude. You know what I thought was part of that too? When Alonso made up the Donnie Stevenson thing earlier in the season, Chili Davis, Alonso said he cried at his locker when they fired Chili Davis. Chili Davis said, the Donnie Stevenson thing probably didn't help. And Alonso was asked about this. I'm not talking about that. And then like a few months later, there were funny Donnie Stevenson videos. It just seems like, well, why can't you just say thoughtfully how that might have affected unintentionally what happened to this guy that you really like? And you were sad that he got fired. It's just like there's certain dots that haven't been connected there with Alonso in some of those ways. And I think he would be part of what I'm talking about with the Mets. He's a good guy. Don't get me wrong. There's just something there that's very us against the world, and he's a big part of their culture. So I would just want to really be careful and really, if I'm them, I really want to think about what they can do, what they should be doing with their clubhouse culture going forward. Alonso should probably be part of that. I'm just saying, like, careful here because he's part of what's going on now, and what's going on now is certainly flawed.
But it's what the point you're making isn't just about Pete, Andy. It's about the leadership around him. And I think that's part of why Lindor is the center of all of this, because he was supposed to be that guy. You're paying him to be that guy. And if you referenced your conversation, or I did, with Dom Smith about him, clearly the players view him as a leader. And, where's Luis Rojas in this? Where's the manager? It's okay. Yeah. Pete can be immature. Some of the things he says publicly aren't in tune with how the fan base feels. The Donnie Stevenson thing was toned up, but where's the David Wright?
Well, he's rare and special. Good point.
I know. And it just doesn't exist right now. That's what I feel like they need. And Pete is can be really empathetic and says and does a lot of the right things. I think sometimes he needs to be steered, and that's all. It's probably just as harmless as that.
I think I think he's a good, interesting, thoughtful person in a lot of ways, but you're certainly right how much the Mets miss David Wright. It's been a while, obviously, since he was consistent presence there. But I also think, and I'm going to criticize Luis Rojas here, which might surprise you, but I think if the players are running the show in there, the cliche would be the inmates running the asylum, which is probably a little harsh, or maybe not. But look, you got to look at a manager there too. So I think
absolutely
that's the first. I'm resistant to a lot of in-game criticism of Rojas, but he is part of what's going on. He's supposed to be the leader, and so Zack Scott, and he's off getting arrested. There's a lot of issues here. I don't want to just put it on players.
Just a reminder, subscribe to the Shea Anything podcast, Apple, Spotify, wherever you're listening. We appreciate it. Another reminder, the Shea Anything is brought to you by Verizon. It's 5G built right for the Mets from the network more people rely on, only on Verizon. Andy, great to have you back. I'm sure we'll be talking on Baseball Night in New York this week and Shea Anything once again next week. So thanks for doing this as always. And everybody, thank you for listening. We'll talk to you later this week with Jerry Blevins.